welcome back to the Waxwing Beginner Guitar Series. I am Elliot and Waxwing is my music school. This is episode 6 of things everyone should know before their first guitar lesson. In this episode we are dealing with building good practice habits. Now, once again, we are now getting into a territory where you don't really need to know these things before your first lesson. Hopefully your teacher will be able to convey these things to you in the first few lessons. But if you have already built some good practice habits, then you will be leaps and bounds ahead of other beginner students. Learning how to practice may be the most important thing that we do as musicians. And not just as musicians, if we learn how to practice, then we can really build any skill we want. So what is practicing? The definition of practice is to perform or exercise a skill repeatedly with the aim of improving. And so an emphasis should be put on the repetition part of that definition, because repetition is everything in practice. To understand this a little bit deeper, I'm going to get into a little bit of my limited knowledge of neuroscience. So when we are practicing a skill, we are really forming neural connections. We have brain cells called neurons, and they communicate with one another. Now, when we are performing an action, whether it's chopping a carrot or going for a run or learning a language, we are forming new connections between these neurons. These connections tell our brain what is happening. So it isn't really enough just to repeat an action once, because the neural connections are very weak. It is theorized that when we sleep, our brain does a cleanse or a pruning of unnecessary neural connections. And so when we repeat an action, what is happening is that neural link is being strengthened. So metaphorically speaking, that neural connection is getting thicker and thicker the more that we repeat that action in the same way. So the signals are being passed along that pathway a lot more readily. Now, if we were to repeat an action in 10 different ways, let's say that we made a different mistake every single time that we repeated an action, then we would have 10 different neural pathways. So these neurons would be connected in 10 different ways rather than one thicker and thicker passage. So if we have 10 different pathways associated with one action, what do you think the chances are that we are going to perform that action correctly? Probably pretty low. We have about a 1 in 10 chance. And we may actually be performing different mistakes the more that we do it. So we really want to be repeating that action in the exact same way every time that we repeat it. This is also why it's very important to have a daily practice, is that these things build day to day. So if you are strengthening those neural connections on a daily basis, your brain will really think that it is absolutely necessary for survival. So your brain will keep those around. Even if you stop playing for a few weeks, those connections will still be there if you've been doing it every day for a few months. That's not to say that we should be taking months off at a time from our practice, but we are giving ourselves a leg up if we have those strong neural connections. So this is the classic practice makes perfect, or better said, practice makes better. Those neural pathways, the more that we use them, are being protected by a fatty substance called myelin, and that protects those neural pathways from being dissolved when our brain is cleaning house. So that's my limited understanding of neuroscience out of the way, so let's jump into some practical things. Most of the professional musicians that I know and that I've had the pleasure of working with always say practice slow. So we want to practice slow and we want to focus on the details. I should add that it isn't just about repeating an action mindlessly. We really want our mind to be involved. We want our attention to be on what we're doing. So we don't want to be splitting our attention in many different ways. We don't want our phone to be buzzing all the time, giving us notifications. We don't really want to be watching YouTube videos while we're doing our practice. We want to shut everything off and devote our attention completely to what we're doing. Now, this is very difficult. I understand this. Focus is a very difficult thing to build. Our society often tells us that we either have focus or we don't. But really, I believe that it is something that we have to practice and that we have to build. And the more that we are building focus, the better we can apply it to certain skills. There will be more on this in another video, so I just want to touch on it briefly. When we are practicing, we really want to have our focus devoted to what we're doing. We want our mind to be thinking about the actions that we are performing. I've asked my students many times before if they find their mind is wandering while they're practicing, and pretty much everyone says yes. Now, we might not always be aware of our mind wandering because it's kind of doing it on its own as if we're not in control of it. But with practice, we can actually gain more control of our focus. So we can be playing the song, everything can be going well, we are conscious, we are there, and then suddenly thoughts start to creep in. I'm getting a little bit hungry. I wonder what I should have for lunch. That person never texted me back. I wonder what they're doing right now. I haven't talked to this person in 10 years. Oh, that thing that they said to me that one time was very hurtful. And then suddenly, we're making more mistakes in what we're playing, and we've played a little bit too far maybe. Now we're in a different territory. Now we just stop, and we think, okay, well, I've done this, so I'm just going to stop. I'm going to put my guitar down. I'm going to go make lunch because I was thinking about that. Obviously, that's important to me. Well, that's not really what we want to have happen. If we find our mind wandering like that, we want to bring our attention back. So you don't have to beat yourself up about having these thoughts. Everybody has these thoughts. But when you were playing, you want your focus to be on what you were doing. You don't want your focus to be on, ooh, this is sounding really bad, or whatever, or I'll never be a good guitar player. We want to kick those thoughts out. We want to just have it be on the task at hand, which is consciously repeating small sections of whether it's a scale or a passage in a song or whatever it is, and so that we are actually improving. The way that you become a better guitar player is by doing that. Now, nobody is perfect at doing this. Having absolute attention and focus while practicing is pretty impossible, but we can get better at it. I really believe of having 5 minutes of absolute focus in a practice session is better than having 30 minutes of complete unfocused practice. You can actually get a lot more done in that 5 minutes than in half an hour of having your focus completely divided. Now, practice is something that a lot of students lament quite a lot. They don't want to be spending so much time just repeating things, repeating small sections of the song that they want to learn. They want to just jump right into playing. I just want to be able to play, right? But I'm going to use the example of some sports. Okay, now you might not be into sports, but I think that these are good metaphors. So if you've ever played soccer or football or hockey or what have you, and you are on a soccer team or whatever sports team, usually you have practice sessions. Now, at these practice sessions, do you jump right in to start playing a game? Not really. The coach will often have people do drills. You're either doing running or you're kicking a lot of soccer balls or throwing passes. Whatever the skill that that coach wants you to be able to build, they get you to drill it quite a lot. And in doing this, we are actually making you a better player while you're in the game. You still have to play games to be very good at that sport. We also have to do those drilled small actions in order to improve as a player. Think about baseball batting cages where people will just stand in one place and have baseballs fired at them and they're swinging their bat at every baseball in order to improve. Or a driving range for golf where people will just hit hundreds of golf balls into nothingness just to get a better drive. Or a putting green, right, where you can just go and drop a golf ball on the green and practice hitting that golf ball into the goal. Or if the sports analogies aren't really resonating with people, think about if you've ever had to memorize lines for drama class or if you were in a production or a play. Do you really just read the monologue that you have from beginning to end? No. Usually what we do is that we take it apart line by line. We repeat the first line 10, 20 times, then we add the next line. Sometimes we just focus on the next sentence and then you add those two together. And then you do the same for the next sentence. You isolate that sentence and you add it to the last two that you just had until you now have memorized the entire monologue, right? So learning a song is much the same. We can also use the example of visual art. If you've ever seen a illustrator's sketchbook, it's not just amazing pictures of nature or portraits of people. Often there are quite a lot of those finished products, but also you could turn to pages where there is 100 eyes all drawn in a row, right? Because they are practicing how to draw eyes from different angles. Or hands, you can see the same hand being drawn 100 different times until they actually put all those aspects together to create a piece of art. So when we were approaching practicing for music, we want to do it in the same way as we would do any of these other skills. Conveniently, songs are often broken up into measures on the sheet music or the tablature, which is these small little sections of the melody or the chord progression or what have you. And these measures are usually just groups of the pulse, which we were talking about in the last two videos on rhythm. And so we already have these small little bite-sized portions of the song broken up for us when we are reading music. So the term chunking is used to describe taking a small piece of a piece of music and repeating that until we can play it very smoothly and cleanly and with the tone that we like. And we want to usually do that very slowly and slowly build up the tempo. A way I like to think about chunking is as if we are eating food, right? So if you were to take an entire steak or a whole potato and you wanted to eat that potato, you wouldn't just put the entire potato in your mouth and try to swallow it at once. First of all, you can suffocate on that potato or a steak or whatever it is. And if you do manage to get it down your throat, then you'll probably get a pretty bad stomachache. We are not able to digest food when it's in its whole piece. But if we cut that food into small, manageable, chewable pieces, then we are much more able to digest the food and it is much more nourishing. Same thing with music or any other skill is we want to break things up into small, manageable pieces. So a first example will sound like this. That is a simple riff that I wrote to be used in a video game soundtrack. And as you can see, we have the music notation above the tablature there. And so the music notation above is indicating the rhythm of this riff, and the tablature below it is indicating where to play it on the guitar. So the first thing that we should do to approach learning a melody like this is to split it up into its components. First of all, when we're looking at this melody, we can see that it is in the time signature 4/4. So if you are unfamiliar with concepts to do with rhythm, I would recommend going to watch either episode 5 or episode 5B in this beginner guitar series, because there's a lot more in-depth instruction on rhythm there. And so the first thing that I would do is I would clap this rhythm so that when we are playing the notes, we can automatically start playing it in rhythm. And it'll start sounding a lot like the song if we have the rhythm right off the bat. It is also very important that we start off very slow. We should also be practicing the rhythm with a metronome, and when we're learning the melody notes, we should also be learning with a metronome as well. So this will be set to 60 beats per minute. 1, 2, 3 E and 4 and 1, 2, 3 E and 4 and 1, 2, 3 E and 4 and 1, 2, 3, 4. Excellent. So we will notice that it is the same rhythm repeated 3 bars in a row, and then we have a whole note on the last bar. So noticing these things make it a lot easier to practice. If we're looking ahead and we can see that we are playing the same rhythm throughout the entire phrase, then we have to learn less rhythms, right? Although the rhythm may be the same, the melody changes bar to bar. And so now we have to look at the melody notes. So that first note is located up here on the 7th fret. Our first instinct may be to play through the entire melody going slowly and doing that on repeat. But really what we should be doing is splitting this up into smaller quadrants. So the obvious part is that we can divide this up into the measures or the bars. So that first bar would sound like this. Okay, that's the first bar. And we would loop that on repeat until we can do it without making any mistakes. If you are making too many mistakes, slow it down by 5 beats per minute or 10 beats per minute and try it again. And so we would set up a metronome and we would play that first bar in time. Now we should be repeating each section 5 to 10 to even 20 times before we move on. And then once we do move on, we can start at the second bar and we do the same thing. We play that one 5, 10, 20 times in a row, playing it perfectly each time. And we have to hold ourselves to this, is that if you make a mistake, you start back at 1 repetition. So even if you are at 9 repetitions in a row and your goal is to play it 10 times perfectly, and you make a mistake on the 9th time, go back to the beginning and start at 1 and play it 10 times perfectly. We really need to keep ourselves to that. This might seem like it is taking the long way to learning something, but I assure you, this is the shortcut. People often ask me, I'm here trying to learn some shortcuts to playing the guitar so that I can improve and get really good really fast. Well, let me tell you, doing it the right way the first time is the shortcut. We can do it slowly, but as long as you can play it slowly, perfectly each time and replicate it, and then we can slowly start to speed it up, you're going to be leagues ahead of the others who just try to throw themselves at playing something over and over again at tempo, so at the speed it's supposed to be played, and failing all the time and hoping they get it right one time. We don't want to throw ourselves at something and just do it really fast, hoping that we're going to get it. If I just play it enough times, I will get it right. You want to play it right first. So play it right first, do it slowly, and repeat that until you will never make a mistake at it again. Now, mistakes always happen, so I say you'll never make a mistake at it again, but I mean that those mistakes will be very infrequent. So we can start up our metronome, and we repeat that one bar. So I repeated that 5 times in a row without making a mistake. Now we want to go slow enough so that we can think about finger placement, where they are on the frets. We want to think about if our thumb is reaching over the top, we want it to be behind the neck, right? We can think about, are we alternate picking down and up in a constant fashion? So we want to be able to go slow enough so we can pay attention to many things at once, so that when we are playing it fast, we don't really have to think about those things as much. All right, so we're laying the groundwork here for when we are starting to play things at a faster tempo. Now we always want to start slow. You want to start slow and you want to stay slow for as long as it takes for you to improve. And then once we have mastered it slow, we want to start to push it. We want to start going out of our comfort zone. And so we want to find a balance between being able to play things slowly and dead on, and then pushing the tempo and risking making a few mistakes. We do want to push our boundaries a little bit. Then once we have mastered that first bar, then we can move on to the second one. And it is just slightly different, but there are enough changes that we do have to drill it on its own. Okay, that was 5 times, and I played that all right, and so you would probably want to play it more than 5 times. 10 to 20 times is a pretty good amount, and you want to make sure, again, that you are playing it right every single time. Now, once you've played those 2 bars a sufficient amount of times in a row, separately, then we can add them together. Now, we don't want to skip this step. We want to add those 2 bars together, so we're playing them as one long bar now. The reason why we do this is because if we compartmentalize these sections too much and then we try playing the entire song, there's going to be a little bit of lag. We're not going to really have practiced the transition between these 2 things. I found myself practicing things too compartmentally, and then when I apply it to the entire song, I actually can't play the riff, even though I've played it perfectly on its own like 100 times in a row. And so we really need to add these 2 things together to practice those transitions. Okay, so those were the 2 bars together. Now you would want to practice those on repeat 5 to 10 to 20 times as well, before moving on to the 3rd bar and finally the last one, which is just one single note. So the 3rd bar and the last note you could probably practice together. Now that 3rd bar there is actually the same riff as the 1st bar in the melody. And so if we notice things like this, we can actually cut down on the amount of things that we have to repeat 100 times. So this next example is how to practice chord changes and strumming patterns. Now we covered this a little bit in episode 5B on rhythm, but I'm going to cover it here for posterity. Now this is an excerpt from a song that I wrote called Speechless. Now it is also put into a different key, so we were playing all open chords. So the chords for this would be C, A minor, C, E major, and the second part would be F major, G major, A minor, B diminished 7, F major, G major, and C once again. So how I would approach this progression is that first of all, we have to make sure that we can play all the chords. So I'd go through and make sure that I know how to play all these chords. C major, A minor, and so on. Next, I would see if I can change between these chords without much pause. So C and A minor works. And so if you are getting stuck between these chord changes because we have never drilled them before, what we have to do is we have to pick two chords. So I would start with C major and A minor, and we would drill changing between those two. So the first chord being C major, the next chord being A minor. So notice how I only have to move one finger, this third finger here, down here, and I am now in A minor. These little details help us with our chord changes, right? So if you only have to move one finger to change chords, that's a big leg up. Okay, now we can put on a metronome and we can try changing chords to the beat, right? And so we want to make sure that we are landing our chord changes right on the pulse. Now we may have to drill that chord change quite a lot of times, 20 to 50 times before we really see a massive improvement. But if we just isolate those two chords and play them on repeat for like 5 minutes in a row, I bet that you will notice that that chord change is massively improved just in that short amount of time. If we were taking the opposite approach where we were playing every chord in a chord progression, for instance, and so on, then our brain has to digest a large amount of information. Now, even if you can play through that by reading it and your chord changes are okay, what are the chances that you're going to remember that, right? Probably pretty low. So breaking things up into small sections not only helps you to be able to drill the action so that you can perform the action a lot easier, it also helps your memory remember. So if I drill the change between the C and the A minor 10 to 20 times, you're probably going to remember that the progression starts with C and moves to A minor. And then if I drill A minor back to C, which is the next chord, you're probably going to remember that that comes next. Now the next chord is C to E major. All of your fingers have to change for this chord change. So it's a little bit more challenging than changing from C to A minor. And so we would have to drill this change as well. We want to make sure that there are no pauses in our chord changes. So using the metronome to keep us on time is a massive asset. So the next example I'm going to play is an excerpt from Rondo alla Turca by Mozart. Now this is mainly just for examples purpose of how we would do the same for a more complex classical song. So although that song is quite fast and quite intricate, we definitely have to apply the practice skills to something like this. The way that I would go about learning this is you can start at the first section or one of the other sections if you want. You don't always have to start at the beginning of a song every time that you're playing it. We should go directly to where we're having trouble. So in this first melodic passage, so I would start right there. So this entails a pull off and then a hammer on, and then we have two notes played at once with our first finger on the second string. And we can take that as a chunk. And once we have chunked that portion and we have repeated it enough times that we are playing it reliably, right, and with the tone that we like, then we can move on to the next bar and do the same process. And then we can add those two parts together. Something that I would recommend is getting a journal. Any notebook will do, and logging your practice. So not only can you keep track of how many minutes you practiced each day, but you can also write down the things that you practiced. So you actually have a written log of the things that you were doing. Something else that you can do with this is something that I like to call goal-oriented practice. So goal-oriented practice is where you set out a small, manageable, achievable goal before you start to practice, and the aim is to achieve that goal by the end of the practice session. So this could be drilling one chord change, or mastering the chord changes between every chord in a progression, or it could be mastering the end 2 lines of a song that you've been struggling with, or it could be there is one chord change in the middle of this song that I mess up every time I play it, so I'm gonna shine my spotlight directly on that and practice that until I iron it out. And so with your notebook, you can actually write down what your goal is. And having that written out, you can actually think about the ways that you are actually going to go about practicing and achieving that goal. This I have found to be much more efficient and much better than just practicing in general. So I'm going to do a little bit of this, and then I'm going to practice the entire song. I'm going to play it front to back, and that's my practice session. And then I'm going to go about my day. It's much more efficient to actually write out the things that you are going to practice and how you're going to achieve those small goals. So your goal shouldn't be something like, my goal is to be able to play the song. Your goal should be something like, I'm going to master the change between the C major and the E major chord, and I'm going to drill it slowly at 60 beats per minute for 5 minutes straight until there is no gap between the chords. Now, if you practice in that way and you have your goals small enough and achievable enough, you should be achieving those goals almost every time you practice. In this notebook, as I said, you can also keep track of how many minutes you are practicing every day. This goes back to episode 1, where we laid out our time commitment, right? So the time commitment being how many minutes you are practicing every day. Now in this log, you can see how you have maintained your commitment. There's going to be days where you practice less than others, and you can keep track of that. You should also be writing out the things that you believe are your strengths and the things that you believe are your weaknesses. Now you should be focusing on building your strengths quite a lot, that's very good, but also if we highlight where our weaknesses are, then we can go directly to them on some practice days and try to strengthen those weaknesses so that they are no longer our weak points. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, they say, and so we want to not leave our weak points in the dark. We want to shine a spotlight directly on them so that we know what they are and we can systematically go about improving them. Now there are some players out there who have famously said they're always playing, never practicing. Now this is great. I think that that's a really interesting approach. They're almost always playing to backing tracks or to a band, and they are experimenting and just playing and letting the music flow from them. But these are players who have kind of already reached a mastery of their instrument. And so maybe they don't have to practice as much as a beginner or intermediate or even advanced person does, and that's fine. But if we really want a process or a system to get better and to get to that point one day, perhaps, then we should be practicing in this way. Now these practice techniques can be applied to when we are working on music theory as well. They can be applied to when we are learning the notes on the fretboard, to when we are learning our scales, whether it be major scales, minor scales, or pentatonic scales, even arpeggios, and when we are learning all the different chord shapes. So we want to break things down into the rhythm, the notes that are being played. We want to chunk things into small, manageable pieces. We can just do it bar by bar or measure by measure, or we can choose our chunks to be even smaller, right? And then we apply those chunks to larger chunks. We just make them bigger and practice that. And we want to repeat those chunks 5, 10, 20, 30 times in a row without making a mistake. And we avoid mistakes by going slowly, right? So we want to have our metronome with us, and we want to have it almost always on, and we want to play in time and not speed up or slow down. We can start to speed up the tempo once we have mastered things at that slow tempo. Okay, thanks for watching. That's the end of episode 6 on building good practice habits. I know there was a lot of information in this video, but please watch it as many times as you need to. Take notes. We definitely learn better when we write things down that we want to remember as well. Try to apply a lot of this practice theory into your playing and your practicing, and take note at how much you do improve. Like I said, this is the shortcut to getting better at any instrument or even any skill, so we need to take this very seriously. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. You can like this video, it helps out a lot, or send it to somebody who you think would enjoy it and benefit from it. And I will see you in episode 7, where we are talking about an introduction to scale theory. See you next time.